Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. My guest today is Oscar award-winning screenwriter Tom Schulman. Tom won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in 1989 for Dead Poets Society.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for.
He followed up his Oscar win with screenplays for two hit comedies, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and What About Bob? In 1997, he made his directorial debut with the Joe Pesci-led Eight Heads in a Duffel Bag, and he recently returned to the director's chair for his 2022 film, Double Down South.
Kino is all finesse. Yeah! Well, you're a fast learner, girlie. I'll give you that. This establishment could use an attraction. We'll back you.
I feel remiss if I didn't warn you about the man you're dealing with here. If Nick ain't got no reason to hurt you, he probably won't. Just go big.
Oh, I can go big. Big bragging rights. Best in the world.
And now, without further ado, I am very excited to present to you my interview with Oscar award-winning screenwriter Tom Schulman.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
I've heard you say that you're not entirely sure if you handled like the post-Oscar period of your career in the best way. And I'm curious why you think that is.
I sort of lost touch with what I wanted to do next, and it was such an assault of offers that I suppose it's similar to being the head of a studio where, you're getting 8 or 10 submissions every, day, if not every weekend, and trying to read those things, knowing that 25 other people are reading them at the same moment. There's all this competition, and it's just very hard to be in touch with your own feelings about things. And I think for a while that I was plagued with that, just could not really get a grasp on what moved me, what didn't, was self-conscious, I guess.
Knowing what you know now, how would you handle that period if you could do it over again?
Well, I was lucky on the one hand that 2 days after the Oscars, I had to go to New York and start working with Bill Murray on What About Bob? And, that movie was ready to sort of start its trajectory toward getting made. But while that was happening, and while I was trying to work on that, there were all these offers coming in, literally hundreds. And it was, ultimately you can't read all those things. So you listen to the one line pitch and go, no, no, and this sort of thing. And I think if I had it to do over, I would force myself to do better due diligence on those scripts, because I'm sure I passed on some really good stuff.
It's one thing to say, I would do more due diligence now, but you're talking, like you said, hundreds of scripts. So is that also like making the conscious effort to like stop working on other projects to give yourself the time to do that?
I think I tried that for a while. I think I said, okay, I'm just going to do nothing but read for a while. But that's when that sort of sense of not really feeling my feelings, not having a sense of who I was anymore, and I mean, I was 38 years old, I think, or 39 when I won an Oscar. So I was deep into my career in a way that, didn't change me in a strange way. I knew that it wasn't going to change the ease or difficulty of writing. That was going to be the same task no matter what. It wasn't going to suddenly, an injection that was going to make me into a better writer or make it easier. So I knew that was the case. I guess what happens is you've got a lot of people suddenly invested in your success and your continued success, and you're getting a lot of advice about that. And some projects which seem really wonderful on some levels, being told, "No, no, no, that's a loser because who's gonna wanna go see that kind of thing?" Well, maybe I wanted to go see that kind of thing, and but, with the fear that suddenly I could take my career and throw it in the toilet, which I kinda did with 8 Heads in a Duffel Bag, but, but at least it was mine and something I believed in, so it didn't hurt as much. And I wasn't used to I guess, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was not mine, and What About Bob was, the producer's idea, so, I was used to doing other people's stuff, but mainly I had written originals to that point, and I think mainly I was still wanting to do that. I think I was writing Medicine Man and believed in that while, post-Oscar, so that helped.
Was part of it too the fact that, I mean, you mentioned how like once you won the Oscar, you immediately had to go work on What About Bob. So it's not like the follow-up to Dead Poet Society was something you had to think about. Like that was just already in the plans. But does it add like a level of pressure now when you're like, you said you like to write a lot of originals, but now is there like, I have to do something that could get to this level of success now? And is that part of like the filter of the ideas you're seeking out after?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I'd like to say no, but, to some extent, you sort of get snobby about your own work. It's like, where's the next Oscar and all that sort of stuff. I think if I could go back and do anything about it, I would try to, blot out those thoughts, those kinds of feelings, and really just work on getting in touch with something I really wanted to do. And I did in a way. I mean, I wrote a script called Dancing Man that ultimately no one wanted to make. Super ambitious project for myself to direct. Uh, Ambitious from a production standpoint and a budget standpoint. In hindsight, insane to have thought I could direct something that with that kind of scope. And then, produced Indecent Proposal, which, something I believed in as an idea and the concept, but only produced, didn't direct, didn't write. And then As in a Duffel Bag came along, that idea just popped into my head and I just, was became really enamored of it and, did it.
In terms of your writing process, there's like this spectrum of like a movie like Dead Poet Society, which from my understanding, you like had the idea and you kind of like slowly worked on the idea for 5 years before writing it. And then Eight Heads in a Duffel Bag was something you wrote in a day or in a weekend or something like that.
Yeah.
So like what does that like initial idea look like for you? And how do you know when it's time to move forward with it?
It's really hard, and the normal process for me is that, an idea will pop into my head and I just start taking notes about it, and if it starts to expand and sort of, becomes the gift that keeps giving, then I just keep working on it, and eventually, if I think there's enough in it, both from a thematic standpoint and just a lot of, delicious characters and scenes, then I write it, and if not, if it sometimes they just die on the vine somewhere in the middle of that process, and I don't think about it, but I find myself not returning to that file anymore, and it just loses its grip on me.
So it's not necessarily like a conscious decision of like you're halfway through and you're like, it's not here. It's just more like an internal subconscious guide, like pulling you back to the material. And if it's
Both. I mean, sometimes I'll just go, I'm in the middle of something. I've had a thing I've worked on, off and on for 30 years, and I just go every time I get an idea. Oh, I know what that thing's about, and I start working on it. And then about a few days, weeks, whatever into it, I just go, this is not working. It's not here. I cannot solve this thing. I don't know what it's about. And when I do know what it's about, it feels entirely derivative of other stuff I've seen. So, let's just put it to bed. Just drop it.
you mentioned how part of one of the things with the ideas good thematically and really strong characters. And from my understanding, a lot of your ideas, like the initial seed is an interesting character and the world kind of builds out from that central point. What makes a character interesting that draws you into that?
It's usually the dilemma of a character in a given situation, and how they're going to behave and how they're going to get out of how if they're in the middle of a conflict, how they're going to get out of it, and if sometimes if I have an idea of how a character is going to get out of something in a really kind of an amazing way, then that's often the end of the story. So, and then I know, wow, I've got a really powerful ending, and I have a pretty good idea how they get there. So that's the starting point. It's usually, the behavior of the character is something that, you know, interesting stuff starts to come out of their mouths, things that are interesting to me. And it's them, not me at that point.
And that interesting stuff, when you say it comes out, is that in like this exploration note-taking process where you're just writing everything that kind of comes to mind?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How do you, when you're going through that note-taking process, how do you know when an idea is one that like, basically what I'm asking is when you have this large page document of, let's say, 150 pages worth of notes, how do you know that all of that is like consistent with the story you're telling? Because like if you're just in my mind when I'm doing something like that and I'm writing down all the cool ideas, when I start to figure out what the story really is, I realize some of these ideas I had earlier on like don't actually fit the story. Do you find that as well? Like,
Absolutely. And part of the next part of the process is just winnowing down and jettisoning those ideas that don't work. And if enough works, you don't mind losing that other stuff. It can go to a file for, maybe another project, but it's not critical to that project, to the one you're working on anymore. And it's easy to just, I mean, the first thing I do once I print the whole thing out, I cut it up into strips, ideas, or whole scenes. Sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes it's 5 pages of a scene, whatever. It becomes its own, thing. And I put that in a pile on the floor, and then I start separating them into middle, beginning, and end sections. And then I start laying them out on the floor of the room, in order. And as I do that, I have a pile of things that are like question mark, maybe this works. That goes next to me, and then X, it's out, and that just goes in another pile. And all the X stuff goes into a manila envelope and into my closet, and maybe something in there will pop up back up and become another script.
other than reducing the font size, how do you figure out what stuff to throw away to get the script to be within a manageable length? Like what guides you through kind of that process of cutting things?
Well, everything I write's too long to begin with. I haven't written a script that's less than 150 pages to start, some of them 180. I worry about it all the time. I try to make them, 120 pages from the get-go. Never happens. But, you sort of find that you start squeezing the air out of the script and, this goes or this scene compresses and, there's something about that 2-hour format that's kind of now built into my brain, and I no longer, I think in those 2-hour movie blocks. So it's gets fairly easy to get it down to 130 pages. And that's when the pain really starts. It's like, God, it feels like there's nothing in here that doesn't belong. But you just keep going. You squeeze your sentences and you try to make, a paragraph that's got, 3 words at the end on the next line. You try to squeeze it, make it so it all fits there, and economize your descriptions and your dialogue and everything. And now I think 120 pages is too long. The hell might scripts that long anymore. 110, 105, 98.
You said how you think in these movie terms now, and I have a quote of yours here. I just lost it. I wrote it down. You were saying, "Unfortunately, I think about structure now more than earlier in my career," and I'm curious of why that you view that as unfortunate.
I think that if you have structure in mind while you're writing, you're automatically limiting yourself. You're kind of trying to fit everything into that cookie cutter world of structure that we've all kind of internalized. Whereas if you're not thinking about that, you allow yourself to go off in directions that maybe aren't going to work, but something really interesting might pop up. So structure on some level or thinking about it is in a way being too self-conscious while you're writing. And I think that's not necessarily a good thing. At least it isn't for me.
Is it when do you really start thinking of structure? I mean, obviously a little bit throughout, but does it really start to come in when you're in that refinement period? Then do you start to think of like, I need to have this at page 30, this at page 60, and that helps you cut things down?
I don't think about those parts of structure. I mean, I think I've internalized the storytelling process to the point where I just trust that those things will arrive on the right. And later, maybe somebody will say, "Well, where's your second act break?" And I'm like, "It's probably this scene," and that'll turn out to be page 87 or 90, or it's close enough. But again, I think we've all seen so many movies. There's been so much kind of that we do internalize those things, or especially if you've been writing them for a while.
Yeah, I'm sure you just naturally tend to write in a pretty clear, like, first, second, third act that just is, like you said, it's so ingrained in you, it's just a subconscious thing at this point. At what point do you let people into the process? Like, when do you let people see the writing?
Not until I have no idea what I could change to make it better. After I finish a draft, I always say to myself, "Okay, what's bothering me about this draft? I know there's something." And there always is. I'm cheating this, or I don't really believe that, or this particular scene I know is gonna be a problem, and I'm trying to hide that. So then after that draft is done, I go in and try to address those things, and then I do the same thing again and again and again. When I finally can't figure out what anybody could tell me that would need to be changed, then it's time to show it to people, and then they'll tell me. Yeah.
And what exactly are you looking for when other people are reading? And I'm assuming the way you intake feedback must be differently when you're getting someone like a friend to read your script versus when a studio is sending you notes. So we'll start with like the friend. So when you send a friend your script and you're kind of getting their feedback on it, what are you looking for in that process?
If possible, the same amount of enthusiasm I had for it when I started it. It's all about enthusiasm. I mean, if they're like, "Oh, yeah, this is good and I enjoyed this," it's like, this is not getting the reaction that I want. I want people to be over the moon about these things. I want them to sit there and tell me, "Oh my god, when I read that scene, I couldn't stop laughing. And that I cried there." I want to, and I don't want them to feel obligated to say that, but that's the reaction I want. If I get that, and then they have a bunch of notes, then the notes may in fact reflect the way I would feel about it if I thought it through. So in other words, they're good notes. If they don't feel that way, it doesn't mean they have bad notes, but it's certainly a disappointment. So, in other words, I want them to be knocked over by it.
If they're not knocked over by it, how do you kind of pull out from them where it's not necessarily working for them? Because I feel like even when you're getting friends and family to read it, sometimes they're a little bit gentler in their feedback and they're not going to be as direct. Like, what is your approach to trying to like navigate that and figure out what wasn't working for them about the script?
I really ask 1,000 questions. I mean, I just probe them. What did you think of the character in this scene? Did this work when this person did that? Do you think it would be better if this other person had done that? Is this character weak in this scene, or are you no longer interested here? I mean, I'm really asking a million questions to try to get them to tell me. Because my first few experiences giving things to read, people to read, was "Oh, yeah, I really enjoyed this. Well, what'd you think of that? Oh, yeah, did you like that scene? Well, that scene probably you could have done this. Oh, great. And what about this character? Did you like that? Well, yeah, they're telling me they like it, but when probed, you realize they've got reservations about pretty much everything. So, that I want to get to those reservations as soon as I can. If they're not there, great. But if they are, I need to know.
Do you find when you're asking them questions, like when you're trying to probe them and figure out what's not working, do you find the questions you ask are things that deep down you're kind of worried about aren't working? And those are the questions you tend to lead with when probing?
I probably, yeah, yeah. But I also go at every scene no matter what. If I love a scene, I'll still try to get them to attack it, if I can, just to see where the weaknesses are. Because sometimes they'll say, "Oh, on this moment, I really thought this was gonna happen, and then this happened instead." And I'll go, "Well, that's what I wanted." Or I go, "That's not exactly the way I thought that worked." I thought, and because they'll pick up on the subtleties or nuances in something that I didn't see, or and then you go, "Oh, okay, I can fix that," or, "Ooh, there's a bigger problem here than I thought." So, it varies, but yeah, I think first of all, I go at the stuff that concerns me or concerned me when I was trying to fix that last draft before I gave it to them.
Yeah, I just ask if that's like almost like a way of, I think it was Joseph Kaczynski was talking about where he loves to do test screenings, but not for the feedback, because as soon as he sees someone else watching his movie, he instantly finds 15 minutes that he can pull out of the movie, like that he couldn't have seen was when he was in the editing bay. So just curious if it was like a similar type approach.
It is, it is. You just I used to back when, I mean, I would type my own scripts, but there was a place called Barbara's Place where you would send your script to have it professionally typed. I would drive it over there, drop it off, get home, call Barbara and go, "Don't type it. I'll bring you another draft." Just the thought of her reading it told me 25 things that needed to be changed. I didn't know her, but it just I knew that, I didn't want anyone to read it suddenly because the weaknesses were all just jumping out at me. And I think that's what Kaczynski means about with the screenings too. You just know right away. As soon as the movie opens, starts playing and the audience is sitting there, you're going, "Oh God, this I should have cut this. I should have replaced that." Blah 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 blah.
This isn't necessarily writer's block, but someone else reading it kind of gives you ideas and sparks stuff. But when you're in, when you face writer's block in the middle of a project where it's not necessarily to a point where you can give it to someone to read, like what are some strategies you have to overcoming that?
I've only had writer's block once. That was the first day of the rewrite on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids because I had so much pressure and I'd put everybody off for a few days and they were just pounding me with phone calls. "When are you going to start? When are you going to start? You have to start." So when I sat down to start on a Monday morning for the first time, I was like, I don't know. My wife said, "Why don't you just start with the next scene?" Like, good idea. So I did that and then I went back and figured out what I wanted to do with the opening. But generally speaking, my process prevents writer's block because if I'm laying all those strips and scenes and pieces of dialogue and notes to myself out on the floor in order and stuff is missing, as it inevitably will be, my unconscious will figure it out for me. I'll put what I think is scene 3 down, and then I'll put scene 4 down, and I go, "Wow, I don't even really know. There's gotta be something in between here because this is not gonna work as a cut." And I spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, whatever, thinking about it and trying to figure it out and going, "Oh my god, there must be a terrible flaw in this whole thing, and I don't wanna think that, but alright, let's just move to some other part." So I pick up the other strips and suddenly half an hour later, while I'm working on something else, I go, "Oh, I know the answer," and I'll sit down and type out that scene and put it in between 3 and 4. So, I don't really have to deal in writer's block because 'cause I'm always doing something.
Is that process, your process of doing the notes, cutting everything up, laying it all out, is that something that's like you kind of dread going into it, but are so thankful you did it every time you're in the middle of it?
I dread it because it's so tedious, you know? You may have to take furniture out of the room and move things off the floor and just it takes a long time, and it takes half a day just to cut everything up into strips, and then once you have all the strips and everything is there and it's laid out, and I have these clear rulers that I lay on top of things because I don't want, a wind or, a door to open and everything blow away. Then I have to tape them into a notebook, and that takes 4 or 5, 6 hours, because each page will only hold a certain number of strips, and so but again, that time is as boring as it is useful because even doing that, other ideas come to you and "Oh my god, I could do this scene this way," and so forth and so on. So it's useful. I stumbled upon it really because coming from a situation where I just had too many notes and didn't know how to couldn't organize them in the computer. So this just happened and it turned out to be a really good way to help, fill in the blanks. Let my subconscious fill in the blanks.
Yeah, there must be something too with like having to do it with your hands and not doing it on the computer. Like I think there must be something with that as well. Like
And I think it's kinetic. You're walking around. It kind of, in some strange way, reminds me of when I was in kindergarten and they had, the shelves full of blocks, and you could take them all out and build a train or whatever. And you put you don't just start the train. You put the engine over there and the caboose over there, and you start building. You're engaged in that in a way that's different than you know typing. So.
have you ever tried to do a film or write a script without it? Was Eight Heads without it?
I wrote 8 heads without it. I think the script I wrote before Dead Poets, 2 or 3 scripts before Dead Poets were all done with. I think I've done it ever since, except for 8 Heads, which just came so fast and furious to me that it just and maybe that was a mistake, but it laid itself out pretty quickly that way. It was such a wild idea that it was like, "Okay, this is worth an overnight, let's see what happens."
Yeah, and then from my understanding, it's kinda got, like, whisked out of your hands and you were kind of the process of you writing it to getting made was quicker than other films in your career, and so that's part of it as well, which also doesn't give you time to, like, to sit and germinate on it as well, right? Because I imagine there's, like, between drafts as well, you're thinking of stuff, and you kind of lost a little bit of that ability with how fast things went.
That's right. I mean, it did take a year to get made, but, it's a farce, and farce is pretty tightly scripted stuff, it's like a domino train, and if you don't you can't just take a few things out because then the thing just stops. So it gets to the point where you're clinging to keeping things close to the way they were or the whole thing's gonna fall apart.
And so you would never write a film again without doing your lengthy process? Like, you view your process as or the preparation, I should say, as, like, a necessary part of your greater process?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I keep looking for one that would not require that, but it doesn't seem to happen.
I'm sure it also lends itself to, like, building the world in which your story takes place in now, because 'cause you'll just have so much additional information that you just know everything about your world, which probably makes it easier.
I think that's right.
I have another quote. I have a few quotes of yours here written down. One of them is, "I resist writing every day." What do you mean by you resist writing? What does that look like?
I think it's another way of saying, that I clean the room within an inch of its life, and, if there were still pencils around, I'd be sharpening pencils, and I'm returning emails, and I'm, just making everything perfectly neat and just resisting it, not wanting to do it and not wanting to do it at the same time, knowing I have to do it, and I'm even excited about doing it, but, you know and I've just come to accept that as almost a fun part of the writing process. It's necessary somehow.
So what eventually is the switch that flips that gets you in front of the keyboard typing?
Nothing else to clean, it's just the room is perfect, and it becomes really absurd to just move one thing and then move it back. It's like, "Okay, I've done that." It's hard and there's no excuse now. I can't. All the photos are standing and facing me perfectly, that sort of thing. Now, there are many days that I'll just come right in here and start working and not resist. Mainly because I think I just thought of something. I wanna make sure I get it down before it leaves me.
Does the days you feel the resistance, does that time cleaning, I'm trying to figure out how to word this properly. Is that you have resistance because you're stuck somewhere, and so instead of staring at the page trying to figure it out, you let your subconscious work by doing the cleaning? Is that kind of what's happening in that process?
I think so. I don't analyze it too carefully because I don't wanna know.
I mean, that's what I like to try to do, but also I think if you try to understand these things too closely, they lose all their power, and so
Yeah. It works I think if I were admitting to myself while I'm doing all this that I'm really just stuck and avoiding things, then I would be on that road of, "Oh my god, what am I stuck about?" And if I'm stuck, I'm stuck. But this just, it's similar to laying all those strips out. You're cleaning you've got a picture frame, you notice dust on the little leading edge, so you start cleaning that off, and you're not involved in thinking about your problem, and all of a sudden you go, "Oh, what I need to do with this scene," and you just jump in, and then you're off in the world of the script.
Harold Klarman told you to work like a grocer.
Yeah, not just me, that's what that was his advice to all theater and film students. That a grocer walks into his, store every morning, and he flips that thing from, closed to open, and you're open for business, and you're open at 7 or whatever your hours are. You don't just go, "Oh, I don't feel like going in today, so I'll go in at 9." Your customers will abandon you if that happens in that world. And his feeling was you just learn to work that way. You're not waiting for inspiration. You're not, you know, expecting to feel great or not tired or any of those things. That's just what you do, and it's a great advice because writing just becomes a habit, just like running a grocery store. You don't wait for inspiration, you don't have to. It just comes when you get buried into that world again.
Do you view writing as an art or a craft?
Both. Both. The art is the inspiration for the moments that you need to make a good story, but the craft is putting them together in a way that works, that where everything lays itself out in the right order and, things arrive at the right time. Story is as well told as it can be, and that's the craft of it. And that's fun because you're whittling down, should this word be before that word? I mean, you get to that late in the game, but is this sentence inverted? Is it better if the second sentence in that block of dialogue is first and all that stuff, that just becomes how does this thing work best?
I like that definition of art and craft because I think so often artists have a tendency to have like the artist mind of like if the audience doesn't get it, it's the audience fault. But by having that look of it as a craft, it's like you have this emotion you're trying to transmit, and the craft is what allows you to transmit it in such a way that the audience is actually able to receive it. And so I think that that's an interesting way of looking at it.
No, I think you're 100% right about that.
And so when it comes to working like a grocer then, you said that the grocer every day at 7 a.m., he's flipping that sign around, they're open for business. Does that mean you have set hours you write at no matter what? Like, are you like a 9 to 4 or what does your writing process look like?
No, I would like it to be 9 to 4, the world intrudes and, you've got doctor's appointments and breakfasts with friends and a million things. But when I get to work, that's, the sign flips and there I am. And it really depends on where I am in the process of any particular script. If it's just the beginning, it's going to be kind of slow going and I can, kind of horse around, but as the world starts to build and then gets denser and denser, it becomes, goes from 3 hours a day to 18 hours a day.
And so I guess so the work like a grocer thing is less about like the timing, but more so just like the mindset of like it doesn't matter how you feel, we do this every day is kind of what that means.
I think so. I mean, back when I was first starting, it was important because I don't think, when you first start, you don't even know if you're ever going to finish a script, much less start. But I think that, it was important at that time, particularly because I had a 9 to 5 job, 3 weeks out of the month, and then 2 weeks off. It was important in those 2 weeks off to set hours, be there, do it, even if I was going out of my mind. And that set the process off in the right way. Pick the time you're gonna be at work, get up in time to be there, and do it.
Was that when you were trying to write a script every 2 months?
No, that was before that. I was just trying to write a script at that point. I didn't get to the 2-month thing until, failure seemed to be right around the corner. And at that point, I thought I've got to increase my output because it felt like back then my craft was pretty good that I could deliver an idea. But the question was, especially when you're trying to sell a spec script, is it a strong enough idea to sell? And since I wasn't a writer who could get hired just on an idea, the only way I could sell the idea was to write the whole script. That's so I thought, you better you better just do it. You can do it in 2 months. And if this is a bad idea, you've wasted 2 months. But, the next 2 months might be the time that, you gotta make a living at this. So
What makes an idea strong? And now that you've written so many scripts over the course of your career, you've seen what people react to. I mean, it's probably an imperfect science, obviously, but like what draws people to an idea?
that's so hard to answer. There's something about the resonance of it that feels universal, even though when you're writing it, you may not even understand that about it. For me, as I took the job of What About Bob, not really knowing that there was going to be this strong need for family in the character of Bob, but I think that resonates in that comedy somewhere. I could be wrong. I don't know, but that it feels like you find those bigger themes somehow. Again, you don't even necessarily know you're gonna find 'em. I'm not sure the writers of Fast and Furious thought that they were creating this ad hoc family that was gonna be the resonating, feature of that movie in spite of all the pyrotechnics through, however many sequels, 9 or what they've got, but that's what happened. So I think there are those larger themes that sort of creep into these stories that make them last, or catch on in the first place. But if you intentionally go for those things, I think you end up with a lot of flat stuff that just doesn't that has no imagination, not very clever, etc.
I was gonna ask if it always has to creep into the story. Like if you lead with theme, it feels a little forced almost or something.
Well, somebody said they write to discover what they think. I don't remember who said that, but a famous novelist, and I think that's right. I don't think we necessarily know when we glom onto an idea and start writing it what it's about it for us, but we discover that as we write it. And if it becomes highly resonant for us, the writer, then it might be that way for the general audience.
I was speaking to a writer director who has just finished his first feature film, and what he told me was the beauty of it is I'm not as interesting as I think I am, and the things that I find interesting, everyone else also tends to find interesting, or what they relate to is what I relate to, and so what you're saying kind of reminds me of that. But with that quote of where we write to figure out what we think, looking back on your career now and the things you've written, whether they've been made or not, are there any ideas that you found yourself kind of like rotating around that you're always coming back to and wrestling with in your scripts?
I don't know. I look back on what I've done and it just doesn't seem to be any. I mean, I guess to some extent the theme of a family, but Dead Poets, those kids were a family, and Bob wants a family, and in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, they're a little family, and the kids themselves, but friendship group like family, but that's such a broad way to look at it. I don't know. I really don't know. I think that novelists are more likely to have stronger themes that they come back to over and over again. In a sense, there's something to say in a way that screenwriters don't have the luxury of doing. Or if they do, they're they're just not as many of them. So, and maybe I'm missing a lot with a lot of filmmakers, but it feels like as a Hollywood screenwriter, you gravitate towards certain projects, but I don't really know why I do. I mean, it's just something strikes me as it's either really clever and makes me laugh and thinks that'd be a great comedy, or sort of touches me in a way, and therefore I want to keep working on it. I don't know.
So with What About Bob, we'll use that as the example, which I watched for the first time just under a week ago, and I loved it. I thought it was so fun.
Okay.
But when you're watching it and you realize unintentionally that it starts to become about family, do you then kind of start to not revise the script, but parse things away that don't fall under that theme? Like, do you take everything you have and then just try to keep it all around family? Or once you've identified that theme, what do you do with your story?
You mean back when I was writing it?
Yeah, we're using Bob as the example, but for any screenplay you're working on, once you figure out the theme, how do you approach? Does it change your approach to the screenplay once you've identified the theme?
Well, for Bob, it's explicit, right? So, he knows he's looking for family, and it's, everything about the family he reacts to in that sort of, oh, the fam. It's sentimental kind of thing, and he really wants one. And, at first you think he's just looking for a cure for himself, but in fact, there's this something deeper behind it. So I knew that once I'd found it for the script, then it just that kept him going. Like once he found the Marvin family and he felt like they were right for him, there was no stopping it. So, it was an integral part of the plot.
But then for other screenplays, when you figure the theme out and it's less obvious necessarily, do you then make kind of edits with the theme in mind, or is it more so something that just kind of exists there in the background?
I think so. I mean, I tend to, yeah, I think so, but I don't. I'm still not clear what the theme of most of my movies is. I don't think I could articulate it in one clear sentence, like you're supposed to be able to. So, with that in mind, I think I'm a little less likely to be culling things just because I'm not sure about its in a relationship to the theme. More because it just doesn't work in the plot, or that it's out of character, something like that. That's the way I'll think about it.
And I guess if you can't necessarily point to the theme, then that means whatever anyone else thinks the theme is correct for them. Like you can't,
Exactly.
it leaves it open to their interpretation. I want to just jump back quickly to that period of your career where you're writing a screenplay every 2 months, because I think that's really interesting. And I'm curious if that is, so this must be before you've discovered the preparation process you do today with all the note taking and laying it out.
I think so, yeah, maybe, yeah.
Because I guess the question is like, how long does that process normally take you to lay everything out once you've got all the notes done?
I've gotten pretty quick. It's a couple of weeks.
But I mean, if you're writing a screenplay every 2 months, like that would eat up a large portion of your time writing.
Yeah. However, it's that, those notes often contain full scenes or fairly detailed descriptions of the entire scene. So once those notes are all together, you can write the script. You can pretty much just write it in, a very few days, a week, 10 days, something like that. Because it's like a Bible telling you what to do.
Is that 2 month or that period where you're writing every 2 months a new script? Is that the period you think you developed most as a writer?
What do you mean?
Like, do you think just in terms of finding your style and how you approach a screenplay with having to do it so frequently, do you think that's where you grew, and like in terms of your abilities as a writer, do you think the most growth came in that period?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I like to say it's just like a muscle, and the more you work it out, the bigger and it gets, the stronger you get. So there's no magic to it in that sense. The more you do it, the better you get.
And I imagine too, it makes you, I don't know if this is the right word, but unromantic about each of your scripts. Like it forces you to not become the writer who wrote one thing and pushed it for 10 years.
For sure that, I know several people like that, and it's very tough, to the extent that they're good friends. I say, stop this, write something else. If your thing is so it's not going anywhere, but work on something else for a while. This won't die because you're ceasing to push it for the 2 months or 3 months it takes you to write another script. But, you know, uh, everyone chooses their own path in that way.
There's another thing I wanted to ask you about as well, specifically. I got the chance to speak with Veronica Cartwright a month and a half ago or so, and she was telling me about Jack Garfield's class. And she mentioned to me that you were in that class with her as well.
I was, yeah.
At this point in time, from my understanding, you weren't writing yet. You still were intending to be a director first. And you were taking this class not to become a better actor, but to become a better director. And I'm curious if you kind of explain that thought process to me.
Yeah, I mean, I got into writing because I wanted to direct, and I felt like I had to have something that some leverage to get to direct. But that would be a script that was so good that they would let me direct it even though they didn't want to. Yeah, I was at USC Film School and had been, through various circumstances, sort of frustrated by not being able to get my hands on a camera and a crew to do the films that we were supposed to make there. So I quit in the middle of my second semester, and just by luck, someone who had been a teacher at my high school was walking past me as I was sitting on a wall down there in despair about what I was gonna do with myself, and pissed off that I couldn't get my money back for what had gone on, recognized me and said, "You look terrible," and I told him what was going on. He said, "I know exactly the place for you to go," and he recommended Jack Garfield's Actor and Directors Lab. So the next day I was over there and, immediately started auditing classes there and then taking them when the time came around, and because I wanted to learn how to work with actors and so forth. So, I mean, the downside was if you wanted to direct, he made you learn to act, or at least act, which was anathema to me. I was terrified of that, but I did it, and, Veronica was an actual actress who was there who was just brilliant, and, which didn't make it any easier when you have these genius people up there who can, completely transform themselves and throw themselves into a scene on stage in such an amazing way. And so the film that I wanted to make at USC, I started making at the Actors and Directors Lab with some friends and people who had cameras, and there were actors there. So we started making a film, and I was writing it as we went. So I think I had written some shorts and so forth. That was the first sort of long short that I wrote, like a 35-minute film. So it evolved. I mean, I think acting, directing, writing all come from the same place.
Is there anything you learned specifically in the acting classes that made you a better, I guess, director time or writer now?
Oh my God, so much. I mean, it just, whole idea of, the imagination throwing yourself into imaginary circumstances, and that's what you're doing as a writer. You're doing it a little bit differently as an actor, as a director too, but just that process is gonna and working on that process from any of those angles is gonna help you as a writer, because as a writer, you're playing one character and then the other character and so forth. So it's kind of a little improvisation in your head.
How do you think about getting better as a writer today?
To me, it's more about just doing it, trying to challenge myself to do things that are different or kind of outside my comfort zone, or just being in a situation where that challenge is there and now I'm going to have to figure out how to, rise to the occasion. I don't really think about getting better as a writer. I just think about, trying to articulate the stories that I think are worth telling.
How do you think you've changed as a writer from the beginning of your career to now?
Well, at some point I decided I think I was writing all kinds of stuff that I thought others would want to do, action films, horror films, space operas, movies that I enjoyed and wish I could write, but were not really as close to me as the more personal stuff that I started getting to with Dead Poets and What About Bob, where I was suddenly realized I'm going to people these stories with people I know from real life, figure out the story, and then I'll cast it with people from, somewhere in my existence, and then they will help carry the story along because I'll have the specificity of them in mind. I'll be able to sort of, take over their imaginations a little bit, and that works better than just, you know, writing as if you think you know a character when you have no idea who you're writing.
So now today, I have one of my final quotes of yours here. I know we're almost out of time. Was that you don't like to make the movies that Hollywood's looking for necessarily? Those aren't the kind of movies you like to write. So what do you like to write? What is your style?
I feel like nowadays I'm just writing much more character driven stuff, stuff that's the D word, drama, with humor in it, but drama. And I don't think Hollywood wants to make drama. In fact, I'm sure Hollywood doesn't want to make drama. They want to make thrillers. They want to make horror films. They want to make, light romantic comedies, and they want to make action movies, Marvel type movies, highly special effects laden movies, which at one point in my life really interested in me and excited me. And now I feel like those movies and the restrictions in those movies from a sort of an executive, studio executive point of view are just to some extent strip them of the pleasure of attending them. Somewhere I don't enjoy them anymore. Just about the time those movies were peaking, and I would still have had a chance based on my track record of writing those kind of movies. I just couldn't couldn't watch them and didn't wanna get involved in the sort of, cookie cutter myth making process.
I like to say, sort of in line with what you're saying, that like the reason Titanic was so successful wasn't because the Titanic hit the iceberg, but because we watched two people we loved try to survive a sinking ship. And that was like the secret to Titanic.
That's so right. Yeah, that's so right.
What is one of your favorite lines that you've ever written?
Oh, good lord. Um, got probably some of the stuff from Dead Poets Society. I guess, "What will your verse be?" Just after the Whitman quote, that. I think that challenge to all of us to think about why we're here and what we'd like to do is something that I still resonates with me.
To quote from Whitman, "O me, O life of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, what good amid these, O me, O life? Answer, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. What will your verse be?
The last question that I ask everybody at the end of every interview is, what does it mean to you to do art well?
It's, you know, when I first started, I didn't really understand the importance of storytelling for other human beings. It just felt like, movies are really cool. I want to make movies, you know. But over time, I've begun to realize how important stories are, not just stories we tell in movies, but in all aspects of our life. So for me to try to tell stories that in some way make people feel better about themselves, love other people more, care more about, you know, their families, and those are the kinds of things I'm hoping to, and live better, live as decent human beings, treat each other more respectfully, you know, all those gooey things, and that's what I'm hoping to be able to do.
There's a power to stories, and you're using that power. Using that power with responsibility.
I mean, there is a responsibility for that. I think if you get lucky enough to make a movie that, you know, hopefully millions of people are going to see, that you somehow inspire the best in people, or at least warn them of the worst. But you know, either way, you know, give people something positive to come out of the movie with. Make their life, you know, life is hard, and it's full of pain. So if we can make people's lives a little bit better, that would be great.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Artwell. If you enjoyed my interview with Tom and you want to watch his latest film, Double Down South, you can find it now on Amazon Prime or Tubi, depending on where you live. If you're looking for another interview to listen to, I highly recommend you go and check out my interview with John Colley. John is a fellow screenwriter who has also collaborated with Dead Poet Society director Peter Weir. Together, John and Peter co-wrote Master and Commander, which went on to be a 10-time Oscar-nominated film. If you want even more from me, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes, where I will send you the occasional essay exploring art and creativity. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.